Hello, everyone. Welcome. Welcome to Metaculture Studio. I have a little scripted thing that I share with you. But before I do that, let me just adjust my screen so that my backdrop is the way it should be. My apologies for this, but ah, at some point, it will be just the way I want it to be. So, again, thank you very much. Oops. Yep. That's as good as it's going to get. Good morning. My name is Ashok Panikkar, and this is a wholly unscripted conversation, as you saw from my having to adjust my backdrop and my screen. This is an unscripted conversation between people who um, trust each other and who are genuinely curious about a topic that they are interested in. So let me start with an opening statement, which is very scripted. I put this together because I wanted to make sure that the primary um, housekeeping stuff as well as the primary ideas come across before Brad and I get into the real conversation. Starting in 2008 and pretty much full time from 2013 and 2014, as the liberal world order started visibly deteriorating, I found myself trying to alert people to what I saw as the real and present dangers to civilization. As you can see from the current state of India, the rise of authoritarian China, the collapse of the Afghan government, the economic and military weakening of the West, and the collapsing of social systems across the world, I may have been understating the urgency. Just for the record, without liberal democracies, ideas like peace, equality, and justice would be irrelevant. For that matter, without liberal democracy, you can give up on protesting the government's action, reading your favorite author, or even talking candidly amongst friends. Those lovely folks in China, Saudi Arabia, UAE, and our own homegrown despots will tell us what is permissible, and there's no better example of that than what's happening in Afghanistan now. Since 2017, from my home office in Washington, D.C., I've been trying to educate people about our existential and civilizational crisis. You can find you can find out more about our courses and activities from the link on the chat. The metaculture studio conversations, are an attempt to go back to the basic foundation that underpins all social activities. I would even say underpins the idea of civilization itself, the warm and intelligent conversation. I don't know about you, but I'm tired of arguments, opinions, and angry people trying to beat up on each other. Here, we are not trying to persuade or even excite. Here, we are trying to model what gentle but meaningful conversations might look like. Each segment, I invite someone very special, not because he is a famous writer or she is a brilliant scientist. My guests here are because they are sincere thinkers and good conversationists whose company I enjoy. So, welcome, Brad. Bradley Roth. I don't want to introduce him. I will have him introduce himself as soon as he comes on. Just so you know, Brad, who is from New York, is right now vacationing in North Carolina and staying at a friend's house. So he seems to be experiencing some internet problems, some connectivity problems. I'm just going to give him a couple of minutes to come on. And if for some reason Brad's connectivity fails him and us, we will have to most regretfully postpone our session. I hope that doesn't happen and that Brad can reconnect with us very soon. While waiting for him, I just want to say that from the time I first met him a few years ago, Brad has been an astonishing astonishingly open person who has um, had a very interesting journey himself, from a lawyer to a mediator to someone who refuses to call himself a spiritual seeker because he's too modest to do that, but who has spent years of his life genuinely trying to understand issues related to spirituality. So I'm also very um, happy to say that Brad has also been an extraordinarily good friend, very supportive of metaculture's crazy initiatives. And I have had the honor of talking with him and with his group in New York multiple times, both face to face as well as online. So I believe Brad is there now, in which case, Brad, please show your face.
Hello. Nice to be here. Grateful to be here. Thank you for the honor of the invitation, Ashok. And my apologies for the connection issues. As mentioned in our kind of warm up to this call, uh, I'm in the hinterlands of North Carolina at a friend's place, and the internet went out yesterday, and we're
Oh,
dependent on a MiFi device. So, but it's very good to be here, and I'm hoping that we'll be able to, technically speaking, remain together.
thank you. Thank you so much for being here, Brad, for a range of reasons. And I was trying to fill the space while you were trying to get connected. And I did a really impromptu uh, introduction of you. So, can you tell the group very briefly who you are? Who do you see yourself to be? And what do you do personally as well as professionally? Who are you personally and what do you do professionally?
Well, in terms of who I'll do my best to answer it briefly. In terms of who I see myself to be, in some sense, I feel like I don't know who I am. That I'm a result of my actions. That as I move forward into time and space, each moment, that I discover, in some sense, who I am and what I'm giving a voice to, what I'm personifying, and always aspire, or in my best moments, aspire to manifest that which is a product of my deepest understanding and best intentions. In terms of the more kind of acceptable way of characterizing oneself, I'm an attorney, a mediator. I'm an adjunct professor a course called Mediation and Meditation at the John Jay College of Criminal Justice, which is part of the City University of New York. And I'm also the co-founder and chair of Mediators Beyond Borders International New York, which is an organization that builds capacity for mediation and advocates for mediation worldwide. So that's kind of it in a nutshell.
And where do you live? Tell us
I live
something
in New
about
York
your
City.
personal life,
I live in
whatever
New
you
York
choose to share.
I live in New York City, and but I've lived in many places, throughout my life, and that's pretty much it.
Okay.
Right now, I live with my wife in New York City, and I love New York, but I've lived in California and in Europe and other locations, DC, and whatnot. So, and you've also been peripatetic. Is that You've also moved. You've also
Yes,
moved around a lot. Is
quite a
that right?
bit.
I kind of see
Yes.
myself as a citizen of the world. I know that's a kind of cliche, and I know you don't like cliches, but I really don't feel. I don't really feel solidly identified with any particular location, and do feel my kind of identity or my affiliation is with the greater body of humanity. And I think, Ashok, you've moved around a lot, and I know I kind of really have heard a little bit about your travels in our discussions. And do you feel similarly with respect to your identity? Would you say?
Uh, well, it's interesting you ask that because my my identity has always been pretty messy. because kind of like you, I don't quite know at any point who I am. I have a pretty good idea about what I want to do. I've never been one of those people who's been confused about how to be in the world. But that's not quite the same as answering the question, who are you? Because I don't identify myself by my race or gender at all, by my nationality at all. Growing up in India, you were usually identified in terms of the family you came from, meaning your roots were very, very important. And I had trouble identifying myself through my family. But I have to say this, I don't see myself as a citizen of the world. I have lived for many years in different countries. And most recently, I moved back to the US after 12 years in India. And I don't see myself as a citizen of the world. If anything, I see myself as, and I'm going to use a very strong word here, crippled by a lack of belongingness. In my 20s and 30s and even 40s, I used to think that was a badge of uh, distinction, that I had lived in so many places, I was very adaptive, and that I was beyond ideas such as uh, um, tribal affiliations, nationalistic affiliations. But today, as I get older, I am starting to realize that there is something hollow in me, that I've lost out enormously. I don't mean in material terms, but I've lost out in terms of being rooted, being anchored. And I find myself a, as someone who is literally unmoved. This doesn't mean that I don't know what to do today. I'm very clear about what to do and how to be in the world. But if and sometimes I wonder, and I'll stop with this, if I couldn't do what I wanted to do, I wouldn't even know how to be in the world today, because that's the only thing keeping me. So I don't know. I think given the topic of today's conversation, given that we are talking about the role or the, what does it mean to be spiritual in a world which is crumbling at so many levels? What would it mean for an Afghani or an Afghan person today in Kabul or Herat or Helmand, who was working with the Western forces, or who was a woman who had started seeing enormous opportunities open up for her, to suddenly um, find the ground beneath her totally taken away. And are we going to look at spirituality as just some kind of therapy for her, or is there another role for spirituality here? Would her extraordinary, let's just say that she's not just religious but she's spiritual, would that help her in any way, given the incipient chaos, given the almost imminent violence that she or her people are going to face? So Brad, I'm not, putting you on the spot, but just tell tell us your thoughts here.
That's putting me on the spot. Well, first, I mean, I was just very taken by your, I mean, by what you had said, and when you said the word crippled, I just felt this kind of stab in my heart by this crippled of non-belonging and this non-affiliation with the greater sea of humanity. And I almost don't believe you, because I do feel like what comes out of you is a spirit of affiliation, of camaraderie, of an identification. I think an identification that goes beyond, as you were saying, creed, nationality, gender, race. And I think that wider embrace of identity is not just an alienation from more cabined identities, but also a greater sense of belonging. But it also pains me that you don't kind of, or it makes me curious. I shouldn't say it pains me, but it invokes my curiosity as to what keeps you going and why you have such a feeling of compassion as you're describing of these Afghani women, of these American supporters in Afghanistan. There's a pain in your voice and in your and I can feel it in myself when you're speaking. My experience is that you really care. So yeah, it raises questions for me about where you're, what's going on there within yourself.
So, Brad,
And I'm not trying to dodge your question. I want to get
right,
to it.
right. No, no, no. But I think the way I responded to the first part of the question begs for this kind of a conversation before we go into the political environment or women's rights and all that stuff and spirituality. So let me just put it this way. I think for far too long, we have been comfortable living in dualities. That if someone is too tribal, if someone is too attached to caste or religion or whatever, there is a certain narrowness that comes with it. And I have always felt that. I have mocked people who were part of special interest groups and whose whole lives were based on fighting for their own sociocentric ideals. I've said, but there's a larger humanity here. We can't be trapped by these things. And I guess all my life I have seen or I have viewed my place in the world as almost like I wouldn't use the word global citizen, but a universal man, a universal being, and with a responsibility for the universe. By universe, I mean the planet. I mean human beings. Okay, I'm not talking of Pluto or Jupiter or whatever, but definitely for the world that I live in. I've felt an enormous sense of responsibility. But as I get older, and this is where this doesn't negate what I have felt for the past 30 years, but I'm adding on another layer of angst that is coming when, as I see the cost of my separation from my tribal roots, from my family roots, from my sense of nationhood, I see an enormous emotional loss. Today, when I was in the US from 95 to 2005, I felt totally at home. I felt totally at home, and I was like raring to go as a creative, intelligent, action oriented person. Today, while all my actions and my creativity and my intellectual work is the same, if anything, it's greater in some ways, I don't feel like I belong anymore. I don't feel like I belong anywhere. And that creates a hollowness in me. My family has moved on. I lost my mother a couple of years ago. And my relationship with my extended family has been much weakened because of my own disappearance from their lives. My friends in the US that I was very close to when I went back to India for 12 years, they've disappeared. My friends in India, because I left for 10 years, they disappeared. I have almost nothing in common with the people I went to high school or college with. When we talk beyond nostalgia, we have nothing to share. So for me, that's what I call a crippling sense of aloneness.
Wow, that's something. Thank you for sharing that and for your vulnerability and transparency with respect to that. And yet I also see you taking the very unusual step of creating your own community of like-minded inquisitors and seekers of truth and of deeper meaning and purpose. And so that's something. Where does that call come from within yourself? That impulse within yourself. It can't. I don't believe that it's crippling because you're carving out a very unusual path, and you're not some sole solitary figure sitting in an attic writing a book or sending out tweets. You're actually convening people to come together as we're doing now in fellowship. And creating community, that has to come from an impulse that's less than crippled, but believes in the spirit of, believes in human spirit, and has an even optimism towards that.
Thank you. You're being very kind and generous. And I get the primary point you're making. Can we just say that at this point in time, I'm struggling to
Yes.
reconcile
Okay.
both of
Sure.
these? Because for me, that hollowness is very real. And as I said right from the beginning, I have never been the kind of person who's allowed my personal traumas to affect how I am in the world. For me, it's almost like a split thing. I have to deal with my demons, but that doesn't mean that I will engage any less in the world. If anything, it motivates me.
Okay. Well, that's a good.
But enough of
Well, no, but that's a good. I mean, that's actually kind of similar to what I would say about your question regarding the intersection between spirituality and the world of, kind of time and space, and the very real conflicts that we find there. And that's part of the motivation of why I wanted to teach in my course mediation and meditation. Is that we start with meditation. We start by looking within ourselves and finding out more about who we are. In just being with ourselves, letting everything be as it is, paying attention to the arising of thought, feeling, emotion, and by becoming more aware of what's happening within ourselves, including the chaotic nature of the mind and the inherent conflict of thought and emotion within ourselves, that we can then become more able. And this is the theory, and I always ask my students to tell me what they think about this, because I don't impose anything on them through their own experimentation with both meditation and mediation. But the theory is that the more that we're able to be with what's happening within ourselves and without reacting mechanically, the more that we'll have space and capacity to kind of provide or to invoke a container or space for others to bring their perspectives and conflict to the table, and then to and to help be of service, to listen, to care, to facilitate, to enable those to to heal, if they'd like to, if they're able to heal conflict. So I would say that also that for someone in Afghanistan, it's terrible. I mean, I'm a news junkie. I'm not in some kind of ethereal cloud, removed, and also try not to use spirituality as an escape, and don't believe it as it is. But I do believe in the nature of human spirit, and throughout history, definitely human beings have been in conflict, have suffered tremendous conflict and stress and strain. And I do believe that there's an indomitable capacity in the human spirit that's not limited to the human spirit, and I think is inherent in the fabric of existence itself, that enables us to more creatively, compassionately, and powerfully respond to crisis. But it's not a
so
panacea.
here's
It's not a panacea in any way,
right.
and I don't know that it has utility in every instance. Whatever we call it, which is the big question. I don't know that it's an object, but the ground upon which we exist. I don't know that it's, when you frame the question, what's the, I think, use of spirituality? Was that the framing of this question that we're having when the world is crumbling? I don't know that that's the frame that's a useful one. I don't know that it necessarily, and in mediation we talk about how we frame issues, and I don't know that that's necessarily, I don't know that it's necessarily the only frame that we can view it through.
I appreciate that. And, when I framed it, it was to provoke.
I know.
Because
I felt like I was being set up a little bit, but then I thought, you know what? I really trust Ashok, so I'm going to go with
thank
it.
you. Thank you. It was not to set you up, but it was definitely to provoke an interest in the viewer or the audience, because I think it could very justifiably be asked by people who are in the throes of societal collapse and personal pain, that those of us who ask them to transcend where they're at are extraordinarily privileged. And sitting in our homes in the Western world, where we are not worrying about bombs dropping on us right now. We're not worrying about a knock on the door that would take us away to a prison or whatever was. I think I don't quite know anymore how, even forget spirituality. When I talk about liberal democracy, when I talk about the importance of liberal values and civic engagement, for many people who are in the middle of the kind of uh, crisis that we've talked about, it seems extraordinarily elitist that you can afford to talk about free speech. You can afford to talk about the importance of collaborative, decision making. You can afford to talk of mediation and dialogue. But the world that I live in, and this is them talking to me, is where the only people coming at me are people with guns, or people who force me to stay in my room, or people who will destroy my entire family. So there is that element. So, but I
Yeah,
have another question for you.
yeah, I do want to, but I do want
Right.
to respond also. I mean, I do think that this, you use the word impose, and I don't really think that spirituality should ever be imposed. And I do also want to acknowledge that that I feel that I'm very privileged, and that I can never imagine what it's like to be inhabiting. I mean, I can only imagine inhabiting the perspectives of others who are less fortunate, and in so many ways. And this is definitely, you just have to consider Maslow's hierarchy of needs to know that when we're in survival mode, that's all we can really attend to. And
Right.
at the same time, I think even in survival mode, I think what can keep one going, if you read some of the survivors of the Holocaust, for example, and when they were in their darkest hours, what maybe sometimes kept them going was their own well of connection to something that went beyond their present circumstances. And I think spirituality connotes or points to that which is beyond time and space, beyond what's happening necessarily in the three dimensional space, kind of to us, that we can, and can afford us a deeper reservoir of perspectives. Um, but that has to come from within, and I'm not a believer in imposing anything on anyone.
Right. I totally get that. I totally get that. So here are a couple of questions for you that I have always struggled with. The first is, why is the idea of divinity or the divine or the existence of a larger quote unquote spirit, why is that so central to the idea of spirituality? Why is it that spirituality cannot be grounded in the real world that we exist in?
I don't know if you're frozen, Ashok, or if I'm frozen.
Seem to be running. Okay, are you back, Brad?
I'm back. I'm sorry. Yes. Okay. I think you were frozen. I'm hearing.
Oh, me
Okay.
too. Okay, but we are
Yeah.
here now. So,
Okay.
why is spirituality so tied to the idea of the divine? Why cannot spirituality be more like philosophy, which also requires the same kind of introspection, reflection, and understanding of the self, and placing that self in the larger universe? Why
Yeah.
is so? So, just to
I can
finish the
only speak.
question,
I can only speak. I'm not a philosopher of
I,
religion. So
I'm not done.
I'm sorry.
Yeah,
I was-
yeah. I think there's a lag time, and there's a lag time. So uh, I'm not putting you on the spot,
yeah.
but you believe and you use the word spirituality a lot. And for me, I have found that word itself and its connection to the divine or to the non material world, what I call reality, I find that very confusing. And between you and me, I find it off putting. It almost seems as though I have to access this extremely esoteric world, which can only come through gurus or some kind of a portal into something exceptional beyond this world in order to access that. And I struggle with it. And I struggle with why spirituality at that level is so anti science, or seems to be for a lot of people anti science, anti critical thinking, all of which are seen as somehow lower categories of existence or thought. So I've thrown a lot of stuff at you. I'm not saying you believe any of that.
Oh, no, it's
So you
fine.
don't have to. You don't have to respond as though, hey, that's not what I believe, but
No,
more in
no,
terms of the people who use that
no,
terminology.
no. Look, when I went to India, I actually studied Western philosophy and was very interested in Western philosophy. And what took me to India was my wishing to connect philosophy to a deeper wisdom. And I went to see J. Krishnamurti when he was when he came to Washington D.C. And I felt this person knows something that had to do with some of the experiences that I had had since I was a very young child, and before I started philosophizing or working with the mind in terms of an analytical approach to working out some of life's trickiest questions. So when I went to India, I went there armed with the idea of comparing Western philosophy to Eastern philosophy, and also had a very similar perspective. I couldn't stand hearing about, for example, reincarnation. I couldn't stand anything that couldn't be kind of proven through rational means. And I had a very kind of argumentative approach to my interactions with swamis and mystics that I met on the Ganges River and in various outcomes. It was only through but I had experiences that where even armed with my philosophical tenets and armor or approach, I was disarmed in a sense through conversation like this one, actually, where I let go through that type of conversation, let go of the mind, and let go. Was able to relax my fixation on the mind for at least a brief moment. I was able to see that it's not an addition of spirit, but when we let go of the mind, when we let go of thought, when we let go of those reference points, there is consciousness. There is something, and I mean, I'll use the word consciousness, but there's something that can't be held by the mind that animates the mind, and that is the very portal through which we see and interact with the world. And it can't be given a name, but you're not. It's not an addition. It's actually almost a subtraction of everything. When we take away the objects in consciousness, we're left with that which is. And I know that might sound esoteric, but it's my experience. It wasn't something I was expected. Again, it disarmed me, and in that, it gave me another perspective on the mind. I don't know if that made sense, but it was just my experience, and that gave rise to wonder. To I became a believer in a sense of something that my mind couldn't hold and couldn't grasp. That went beyond duality. That's here in this moment. That doesn't, where it's a consciousness and a knowing that's indivisible by the mind, and that doesn't know any division, doesn't know any limitation. This doesn't know time and space, and it's eternal and never born, never dying, to use mystical phrases. But it's not an addition. It's not a belief. It's not a creed. And that's just my experience. And I can't speak to anything else, really. Does that make at all any sense?
Yes and no. Firstly, the language you're using and the vocabulary, I have heard this from many people I have had conversations with. And I'm not dismissing it. I'm saying, so the language you have used, even though you say it's your experience, it is similar to the experience of many people that I have talked with, who come from kind of the same space you're coming from. So it sounds familiar, and I'm not questioning or debating that at all, because it's your experience. What I'm struggling with, and here I come with my experience of teaching critical thinking for 32, 33 years now. And the more I delve into critical thinking, the more I understand that most people do not know how to think critically. In fact, do not know how to use the mind. So when I hear people dismiss the mind as going beyond the mind, subtracting the mind, or adding to it, as the case may be, my first response, reaction internally is, but how many people really know how to really use the mind, how to construct the mind from the brain? And one of my course in critical thinking, I think of it as from a journey from brain to mind. And the way I and many other people who are genuine critical thinkers. And this has nothing to do with studying the subject, it has nothing to do with PhDs, it has nothing to do with IQ at all. The idea of really understanding the complexity of multiple levels. Firstly, the complexity of the world we live in, the complexity of the universe beyond the world we live in, the complexity of our internal lives, from our psyche to what happens to me and in me, which affects the way I'm in the world. And finally, the complexity of the mind itself, beyond that of the whole body and the whole being. It requires such a nuanced, subtle way of looking at the world that what you are talking about as consciousness, I'm not entirely certain it requires subtracting anything from the mind. In fact, that is what I call dualistic thinking. In fact, one of my biggest problems with the spiritual world is that they use dualism and getting away from dualism as a basic tenet, but they always see the mind or anything logical or reason based in dualistic terms. So for me, I find that really difficult. The people who are most against dualism seem to be seeing everything in dualistic terms. And for me, my problem is not even with spirituality. If I have a problem, it's with the way spirituality itself draws itself into a tight corner and says it's superior and bigger and more amazing than anything else and can only be reached by shutting out the mind. So there is almost like a polarizing effect that I get from the world of spirituality. I can't see why the mind should be an enemy. And I'm not talking of Descartian logic. I'm not talking of engineering. I'm not talking of linear A plus B is equal to C. All of that is very limited and not what we call critical thinking at all. So I'm just struggling
There's a lot there. There's a lot there. May I
with hearing you. Yeah,
So first of all, I'm a
please.
big believer and fan of critical thinking, and in fact, I can disclose that I've signed up for your course to take critical thinking, which I'll give my thumbs up to, and encourage everyone to take Ashok's course, which I think is starting next Saturday. Is that correct, Ashok?
We may postpone it by a couple of weeks,
Okay,
but
so I'm a big fan. The last thing I'd ever want to do is dismiss critical thinking, and in fact, as an educator, as an attorney, as a mediator, I mean, these are all things that I value. I would never wish to dismiss those, nor would I wish to kind of set up and we're using language. So when we make distinctions, of course, we language enables us to do that, but it also has the effect of dividing. And so when I distinguish the mind from that which maybe is not the mind, it almost seems like I'm excluding the mind from the ambit of that other, the reach of the otherness, and I don't mean to do that. Certainly, that which I'm describing, that this consciousness, this awareness, definitely encompasses and includes the mind, and in fact enables us, I find, to be able to use the mind as a tool even more, with more adeptness, with more subtlety, with more nuance, than if we're only seeing the mind without that space around it. Then we can get lost in thought, and a lot of times just get carried by the machinations of our own, of the mechanical nature of the mind, and not be able to see thought as an object in consciousness rather than but just see it as only subject. I mean, a lot of people, and I don't know, Ashok, when you have a thought, do you identify? And many people identify when they have a thought, they draw conclusions about who they are as a person. So if something comes across the screen of their consciousness that says, that's maybe a violent thought about someone they love, or an uncharitable thought about someone who maybe deserves our compassion and understanding, many people will conclude that this means something about themselves, as who they are as a person, because they've had those thoughts. And my understanding, my experience was, after I had these experiences, was that I was able to see that thought was happening in the screen of consciousness. It wasn't only the only aspect of who I was, but was only sometimes it was mechanical. It had nothing to do with who I am as a person. And that space between thought and who I knew myself to be enabled me to then discover an identity that was beyond the mind. And so, but it's in no way to demean the mind or dismiss it. The mind is a beautiful gift of our humanity, and I share the love of the mind with you very much, and look forward to our journey together. But I do think that to kind of to indicate that there's a space within which all of this beautiful thinking occurs doesn't mean to in any way demean that which occurs within it.
Brad, thank you. And I think the way you described that example that you gave is exactly what I teach in critical thinking. So my problem with spirituality and people I talk with is that they have such a problem with the mind as limited. I mean, I'm not talking about you. You've clarified your stance. But what you are talking as being beyond the mind is exactly what I teach in critical thinking. And so my challenge is, and part of where I'm coming from, Brad, is not out of our conversations, but I talked with somebody from the UK last week, and this is a very, what one would normally see as a wise person, must be in his 60s, has spent decades in India, still goes there, and had such a narrow understanding of what the mind was that even though I was so enthusiastic about getting to know him, I found that I had to literally say that even if he was talking about getting past dualities, he was stuck in dualities, so stuck. And I was feeling kind of almost like disappointed that the best people are stuck in this duality even as they attack it. It's kind of like the ones who talk about oppression and wanting to travel beyond oppression, and who are attacking patriarchy, who are attacking white male supremacy, all that are so oppressive in the way they deal with people who don't see the world their way. So this is the thing that I struggle with. But coming back to this, that example that you gave is such a beautiful one. A thought comes or passes me. It's happening all the time. Until about 10 years ago, that thought was a reflection of me. It had something to do with the kind of person I was. You're right. But the more I used my mind, the more I tried to finesse the instrument that is my mind. Now, that's not the way I respond at all. I see that thought as almost like an artifact, as something that exists independent of me. But it's a very interesting thing to watch as it goes by. And for me, the more I teach critical thinking, and I try in a limited way to internalize that. And I say this because it's very important. I can be a very I can use my mind in a sophisticated way now, and 5 minutes later I can revert back to a highly reactive emotional state where that mind is completely almost disappears. So it's not a constant state. It's something that I'm constantly trying
Well,
to
how did that
get
state?
to.
How did that?
You know,
Do you? I'm curious, Ashok. Can I ask you? Do you remember that moment? Because I remember the first time when I noticed, I actually saw for myself that the mind is not who I was. In a it was a dramatic way. The thought came, and almost a dislodge. In other words, it was very close. It was almost like I was absorbed in the thought. Right, felt that the thought was all that existed. It was almost like a glacier sliding off of a landmass. It
Brad,
almost shocked me. And I saw, oh my God, this is not. I don't know if
go on. You were
our
breaking
connection
up.
is hanging
You were
again.
breaking up.
Okay, okay, my apologies again. We're
No
with the
problem.
mercy of the
Can you just
technology.
repeat the question? Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, well, I was curious because that sounded like I was very interested. I'm interested in everything you're saying, but I was interested particularly when you said that about 10 years ago you noticed that you were able to discern that your thinking was not your identity. That when you had a thought, it didn't necessarily mean that it was, that it reflected who you are. That you had a good thought, you're a good person. You had a bad thought, you're a bad person. I don't know. Maybe I'm putting words in your mouth, but in some way you disidentified with thought, which is to me a very pivotal moment in one's. It was a pivotal moment in my journey, and it was a kind of dramatic, and I still remember it to this day.
Right.
Can you tell me, was that an experience that happened in that you can identify that moment when that occurred, or was it just a kind of a gradual understanding of or changing relationship to thought?
Nobody's ever asked me that question, so I really appreciate your asking me that question. This is why I enjoy these conversations with you, Brad. So let me put it this way: it wasn't a flash of insight at all, and the best way I can, in hindsight, I can kind of try to make sense of it is that until the age of 48 to 52, I'm 63 now. Until the age of about 48 to 52, I felt an enormous sense of power that I could affect the world. Whether it's, my heroes, whether it's Martin Luther King or Ralph Nader or, Margaret Mead or whatever, that idea that an individual could do all that. And everything I did, particularly after 1988, was driven by my sense of individual power that I could create the kind of change that was necessary. But something, no, life happened. And between those ages, I realized how impotent I was. I realized I could do nothing. And this was a rude shock. Now, when I say rude, a rude shock that came over 4 to 5 years. And I suddenly realized, man, I'm nothing. This forced me to see the enormity of the universe, the enormity of the complexity of not just my life and the life of people around me, but the systems on this planet, leave alone the universe. The systems on this planet are so complex and so fine and so nuanced, and I'm just this speck. It really brought me down to earth until I realized I was nothing. I was nothing. And about 10 years ago, I realized the utter insignificance of me. And this also, rather than bringing me down, it was extremely liberating. It made me recognize that I could completely live with the idea that I will not get a Nobel Prize, that I will not change the lives of the poor in most parts of the world. I will not be able to bring liberal democracy to even India beyond at a level. And I realized that everything that I do and everything that I think is is not just insignificant, it is at one level irrelevant, and therefore it forced me to be humble. It forced humility upon me. And the moment I did that, I could see all my actions and my thoughts and everything else as just artifacts that I have no control over. They are not me because I don't exist. How can my actions be me because I am insignificant?
Wow, so
So it's
that sounds like a spiritual realization of some sort, Ashok. I know
but
you
for me
resist
it's
that.
not. Yeah, no, I
Oh,
get
no,
it.
that's
I get
fine.
No, I get it. I get that's the way some people might see it. For me, it is purely through acute thinking in the most robust, unrelenting way. To recognize my insignificance for me is an act of reality. It is unremitting acceptance of the complexity of the world. I mean, the universe is so huge. A town is so complex. Human, your mind is so complex. There is no way I can even hope to understand you, even if we spend 10 years together. Now, if that's the case, you know,
That wasn't just a
I don't
thought.
have to worry about making
That
all
wasn't
that
just a thought
of
you
a
had, Ashok. It wasn't just a thought that you had, though. This wasn't just a conclusion that you had via
no.
a train of thought. It was a realization within which thought occurred.
Right.
Correct? I mean, it was something. It almost sounds to me that it was an ineffable kind of shift of context that, or maybe it wasn't even ineffable, but it's, in terms of trying to concretize it, it's almost the context in which you existed shifted from one that was limited and cabined by your own sense of identity and your own understanding or narrative of your trajectory and your place in the world and of the world, and then broadened out to something almost infinite, but something that didn't have those borders or boundaries. And within that, you were then able to relate to your experience of thought, feeling, emotion differently, because you realized that instead of your thoughts being right here and being of utmost importance and pivotal for world change, that you realize, oh my gosh, I'm existing within a vast universe. Not just, of course, you understood this intellectually, but then almost experientially, which changed your relationship to thought and to the constituents of thought. And to me, that is, again, I mean, it sounds to me that how you have, I mean, spirituality, we didn't define terms here at the start, which is fine, which is, I think, okay. But I don't know that spirituality has to be an addition of a kind of a woo-woo other. I think that what you're describing is essential to a spiritual realization. And in fact, there's Ramana Maharshi, which is one of the greatest realizers, comes from Europe. In fact, the person whose house I'm staying with has a book of his, not of his, but speaking about Ramana Maharshi here, the sage of Aranchala, forgive my mispronunciation, but his spiritualization came as I think he was a 16-year-old boy, and he was overcome by a fear of death. And he lay down on his cot. I haven't read the book for ages, but just my understanding is that he lay down on the cot, and instead of resisting the fear of resisting death, he allowed himself to understand that he had died, and to give and to have almost died. He gave himself to death, and as a result, he had a greater consciousness or a greater awakening. So I don't know that it was an addition of anything. It was letting go of attachment to mortality in a way that reminds me a little bit of what you're speaking about in terms of letting go of this kind of fixation on on time and space. Sorry, I became a little bit distracted by the private chat. So it's And I don't know, but yeah. So I think that that with respect to, I would question. You're a critical thinker. I would question whether or not the word spirituality needs to mean what maybe we use another word. What we think it does.
Absolutely. And my problem, okay, now I'm echoing for some reason.
Sorry.
Rukmini, and no, I'm echoing. I don't know what happened to the sound. In other words, I'm getting feedback back when I talk.
Okay.
Okay, so that has been my problem with spirituality, quote unquote spirituality, has always been the vocabulary, the dualism. I'm throwing it right back at those who are claim to be spiritual. The dualism and the minimizing of the mind, none of which you are doing. But this is the way it always seems to come across. And for me, I don't claim that my experiences, the what I narrated to you, are in any way spiritual at all. For me, it's really trying to manifest the two core principles of critical thinking, which is transcending egocentricity and transcending sociocentricity. And this has been so difficult, so difficult. And at least in my case, unlike people who were able to do this at a younger age, I was so egotistical. Now, egotistical did not mean an absence of compassion, an absence of empathy, an absence of wanting to do good in the world. And these can coexist wonderfully. Now, but I was really egocentric, and it took being beaten black and blue, being trashed by people that I cared about, people I tried to help, for me to reach that place. And over a period of time, when I realized, you know what, it doesn't matter. You have no control over what happens in the world because of your actions. You have no control over how someone will treat you merely because you've treated them well. And this has informed my work in democracy. And that itself is a huge conversation for you and me to have at other levels, because democracy requires us to step back from our own needs, for a Dalit to step back from Dalit needs, for a woman to step back from women's needs, for a Christian to step back from the Christian's needs, in order to work towards a common collective good, not in the communist sense, but in the liberal, open minded sense. And we can't be democratic because each one of us is so mired in our egocentric and sociocentric ways. So it makes me, yeah, it makes me question even the work I'm doing now. Sorry, go on.
No, don't be sorry. There's so much. So we could probably spend, just in your last sentence, there's so much in so many of your sentences that I'm kind of like, wow, I want to kind of unpack that. And so when you're speaking about kind of the black and blue, experience that you incurred and went through as a kind of as not only painful, but enabling you to disinter yourself from some degree, or to dissociate, to have more space around your ego. I think is a very important experience, and I think that is also a kind of And I have to say, I have a little bit of aversion, honestly, to the word spirituality itself. You say that I use it a lot, but I don't tend to really like that word so much, because it does connote the addition of something other than what is. And to me, spirituality is not the addition of anything necessarily. I mean, in our experience, there can be an addition in a sense, but it doesn't have anything to do with other than what is now. And so, with ego, I think with my experience also is very similar, there are some similarities, but I had to get my kind of butt kicked multiple times by many times well-meaning friends, and those I trusted and cared for. in order to realize just how much I was blinded by my own sense of self and my own sense of importance, self-importance, and which did not always enable me to have the space to really hear hear others and be with others, and to almost to really even feel others, to let others in, to be able to really listen, which, as you know, as a mediator is critical, to be to hear and to listen, and also to be a member of a citizen of the democracy. It's critical that we be able to listen and to let other perspectives in the way that you're discussing, because we're only taken by our own identity group, by our own identity, egocentric, social-centric, nationalistic, whatever it is, that we're not going to have space to hear the concerns of others and come to a mutually acceptable, and this is where mediation and democracy kind of overlap also, acceptable agreement that will enable us to go forward into the future, not necessarily having everything that we want, but having enough so that we can realize mutual gain. And for me, this is the overlap also between the spiritual realization and mediation, because in mediation, to me, it's also an opportunity for individuals potentially to realize their non-separation from the other, to come together in a space where they realize, I have my perspective, my story, my point of view, my very strong feelings and emotions, but there's another perspective here, and to almost realize that sometimes there's almost a magic moment when you realize that something wants to happen. Now, I'm not saying that there's an entity that wants that to happen, but there's a synthesis, and there's where you don't need to divide the pie. I'll use these aphorisms or these, but to expand the pie. And that, to me, is also non-separate from this unifying vision that has to do with reality. And I think that your vision of democracy has to do with the realization of non-separateness, of wholeness, of the possibility for us to join together in something that's greater than its parts, than its constituents parts. And that, to me, is what the spiritual vision is. It's not something other than an escape from, a denial of. It's in no way a denial of anything. It's a realization that has very much, I think, a lot to do with what's motivating you to see a greater potential in this democratic experiment, which is a realization of a greater good that goes beyond the egocentric, limited, self-centered, or nation-centric, or devised or dividable perspectives, but a greater wholeness, a greater good. It's a very interesting overlap. I'm not saying they're the same. I don't want to glom them together, but there's strains in it, which is why I think we have an affinity here that's maybe not as across the divide as maybe the question that framed this conversation might imply.
I can live with that. I can totally live with that. So, as far as I'm concerned, Sri and Rukmini, do you have any questions for us? Because if we don't have questions, then Brad, unless you have some questions for me, we don't need to, occupy the entire 90 minutes. So Sri doesn't have any questions. Any last thoughts, Brad? Any last thoughts or last questions?
Again, there's so much to unpack. I guess I would ask you if you could keep, not that you don't have one, but despite your experience with spirituality, if you would keep an open mind. Do you feel you have an open mind about about whatever placeholder we could use as the word spirituality? I guess Rukmini is asking a question: why are spirituality and democracy assumed to be mutually exclusive? Can we see them as not mutually exclusive? That's my question for you, to kind of add on to what Rukmini has written in the private chat, because I think there is a lot of overlap, and maybe they're not as far off. If you let go of what spirituality means in popular culture, in yoga journal, and and whatnot, can we maybe look at it from a different perspective and see that maybe they're not in conflict?
So I don't know where you folks got the idea that I see them as mutually exclusive. I've never said that.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's not something I have to explain because I've never seen them as mutually exclusive. So that's the first thing.
Right.
My problem with spirituality is essentially the way it is used by most people I have talked with and most of the teachers who talk of it as something other than the worldly, other than the real, other than what science or critical thinking can show you. That's my problem with it. So when I talk about my experiences and Brad, you say, well, in your mind or your experience, that equates at some levels with some kinds of spirituality, then I don't have a quarrel with that anymore.
Yeah.
My I am persuaded until I have been proven otherwise that the kind of spiritual expansiveness, the ability to transcend the ego or the sociocentricity is not something that cannot be attained, is not something that cannot be attained through a nuanced, complex mind. And for me, critical thinking is merely that, the ability to fashion a subtle, nuanced, and complex mind, an instrument that is capable of taking you places. And it's not just critical thinking. I mean, when I talk of critical thinking, I'm folding into it the imagination and creative thinking because I've been teaching that for the same period that I've been teaching critical thinking. And at one level, these collapse together because it's really about a phenomenally equipped mind that can get to places where the average intelligent, educated person cannot because their minds are too reactive, they are too defensive, they are egotistical. Or today, with social justice, they are sociocentric. I can't tell you, some of my best friends today are they're so much of they're so multiculturalist, anti-racist or anti-sexist that they don't even know who they are anymore. They don't even seem to have any capacity to use their mind except from the lens of being an anti-racist. It is so tragic. For me, there has never been a point in my last 40 years where I have seen so little critical thinking amongst the elite. And I count all of us as elite. We are the privileged, we are the educated, we're the ones who've been exposed to things in the world. And I see so little critical thinking. And I see so much of talk of spirituality. So for me, it's like, oh my God, either I'm missing something, I'm supremely disadvantaged because others seem to have, even 25-year-olds who've taken a meditation retreat or whatever, they seem to have this capacity to go into places that I can't and I don't understand. And yet they are so egotistical that I can't understand how they can even claim to these things. So anyway,
I appreciate that, Ashok, and I think that that's why I really always appreciate. I mean, I appreciate your relationship to the mind in all of this because there are critical thinkers who I don't think can get that space around the mind, and can go incredibly sophisticated ways of thinking and make distinctions that are grounded in logic and language, and it could be extraordinary, but it doesn't necessarily have to do with wisdom. And I really appreciate your connecting the
yeah,
mind with wisdom, which was what prompted me to be I was dissatisfied with philosophy as it was. I loved the experience of what the mind could do and how it could refine and
right,
make distinctions, but I didn't see the connection to wisdom. And I do think that
right,
that your perspective on the mind speaks to the context in which the mind occurs, or which the movement of mind occurs, and I think that that's, and which implicates also the character of the thinker with respect to relationship to ego. And I think
absolutely.
and so I think that connection between knowledge and wisdom is essential. And what motivates me, as it motivated me to go to India, and I felt was a continuation, the spiritual or whatever experiences I had did not take me away from the valuing the mind. but also as an educator. I want to connect what we're learning about these principles of, say, mediation to the individual's own, the student's own experience of their own mind, of their own actions, of their own life experience, so that it's grounded in their own, so that it could lead to wisdom. It could be connected and not divorced from. You're describing a split between knowledge and how one's living in the world. And I think that's really essential and really key, and why I so enjoy speaking with you, and why I'm looking forward to your critical thinking course. So this has been a
I'm
real
excited about you being there.
pleasure.
And thank you for introducing the word wisdom. This is something that I use a lot in the critical thinking course because it's a much misunderstood term. And just for reference, even the word knowledge is so misunderstood today. People think they can acquire knowledge, and that's a fallacy. You can't acquire knowledge. You can acquire information. Knowledge needs to be constructed by each person with extraordinary effort.
I love that. I love
And
that.
most people are too lazy to
Thank you
do
for that.
that.
That's wonderful, because it's knowing, right? It's information,
Right.
right? So the knowing implies that there's the knower, right? Who needs to
Exactly.
exactly. So I
Do
love
some
that.
hard work.
Exactly. So I really love that. So, well, yeah.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Brad. Thank you very much. I want to, if
Thank
anyone
you.
is watching this on YouTube, I want to say that I would encourage you to send your questions to me. My email is on the chat. Shri, would you put my email on chat, please? It's Ashok at metaculture, one word, dot studio. I would love to have questions. And if you have questions for Brad, please send them to me. I'll be happy to refer the questions to him. But thank you again, Brad. It's a great
Thank
conversation,
you, Ashok.
as always. And it looks like I have to put the email ID. Let me just put it up there. So if anyone is interested, they
Yeah.
can send us questions. Brad, do you want
And
yours?
I want to thank Ashok. I not only want to thank you, I want to thank Shri and Rukmini for the support. I really value this opportunity, and your whole team, and your whole team behind Metaculture and the courses I've taken. And it's certainly been an incredible labor of love that I'm so happy to be a part of, and to be able to support and to be a part of this conversation with you. And I look forward to many more conversations in the future. And I also want to thank everyone who joined us, of course, as well. And anyone who might view this in the future. I look forward to hearing your thoughts and objections and whatnot, and learning from you as well.
Thank you, Brad, and thank you, everyone. Thank you, Shri and Rukmini. We can end the session now.